My name is Irene. I am 65 years old, a widow, and the owner of a villa that has been the heart of my life for decades. For most of my years, I lived quietly, raising my only son, Thomas, and building a life of dignity. I never imagined that on his wedding day, in front of 100 guests, he would demand the keys to that very villa, as though it were nothing more than a trophy to be handed over. The hall shimmered with flowers and crystal chandeliers, the music swelling as if to honor not just a marriage, but a kingdom. I stood in my modest lavender dress, a simple string of pearls around my neck, watching my son take his vows. Pride battled with unease in my chest. Then the moment came, unexpected, brutal. After the toast, Thomas lifted the microphone with a confident grin and announced that the villa, my home, my sanctuary, would be his and Julia's wedding gift. Gasps filled the air. The guests turned toward me, some already clapping as if my consent had been guaranteed. I felt the weight of 100 eyes pressing down. Julia, in her lace gown, pressed her palms together as though in humble gratitude, but I could see the gleam of triumph in her eyes. I did not clap. I did not smile. My fingers tightened around the stem of the glass I held, the cool surface grounding me. For a moment, my mind reeled back to the years when Thomas had promised to protect me, to stand by my side. But those years seemed to have dissolved in the shine of ambition and the whispers of a family that had never truly welcomed me. I stepped forward slowly. The hall quieted, waiting for me to confirm what Thomas had declared. My voice did not rise, it did not falter. "No," I said, just one word. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Julia's painted smile wavered, and then, as if on cue, tears welled up in her eyes. She clutched Thomas's arm, whispering something that the crowd could not hear, but that sent him into a blaze of indignation. He turned on me with a sharpness I had never seen in his eyes before. "You would humiliate me here, in front of everyone? On my wedding day?" His voice rang across the hall. He shook his head as though I were some stranger who had betrayed him. "You're selfish, Mother. You've always been small. That villa should be ours. You should be honored to give it to us." I stood in front of the guests, feeling their judgment slicing through me. Some whispered, some frowned, others looked away. My cheeks burned, not from shame, but from the cruelty of hearing my son treat me like a beggar rather than the woman who had given him everything. Julia's tears ran down, leaving trails across her flawless makeup. She turned toward the guests and murmured through sobs, I never thought his own mother would ruin his happiness like this." She buried her face against his shoulder, a perfect picture of injured innocence. The hall shifted. Sympathy for her, scorn for me. I could not stay in that place any longer. My heart pounded, but my spine remained straight. Without a word, I placed the glass back on the table and walked toward the exit. Each step echoed against the polished floor, a drumbeat of defiance. People parted in silence, their stares heavy, but no one dared to stop me. At the doorway, I reached into my small purse, pulled out my phone, and dialed a single number. My voice was low, calm, almost colder than the air-conditioned hall I had just left behind. "It's time," I whispered. No one outside the room knew whom I had called. No one understood why I left with such quiet certainty. But I did. An hour later, when a man none of them expected would walk into that glittering hall, they would understand why I refused to bow. They would see my son's jaw drop, his certainty crumble, his world turn upside down. For years I had lived as though invisible, dismissed as just an old woman clinging to her memories. That day, standing at the edge of his wedding, I realized invisibility could be power. I could be silent, but I would not be erased. I still remember the look in Thomas's eyes when he tried to shame me in front of those guests. He thought he had won. He thought the weight of 100 witnesses would crush me into surrender. Instead, it only clarified what I must do. Life has a way of cornering us, making us feel that our only choices are silence or humiliation. But there is always another path, the one where silence is not weakness, but a weapon held close until the right moment. I took that path, and as the music inside swelled again, as laughter resumed without me, I stepped into the quiet of the evening, the phone still warm in my hand. My story did not end there. In truth, it had only begun. So stay with me. You may think you know how a mother's love should play out, how loyalty should bind tighter than any rope. But sometimes, love must be tested, dignity must be chosen, and justice must arrive in silence. If you've ever faced betrayal in the place you least expected, if you've ever felt invisible when you knew your worth, then this story will speak to you. And while you listen, I invite you to join me. Share your thoughts. Share where you're listening from. Your presence here is what turns these memories into something larger. A reminder that none of us walks through betrayal alone, and none of us is too old to begin again. That night, at my son's wedding, I walked away with nothing but my dignity, a phone in my hand and a secret yet to be revealed. And when the man I had called stepped into that hall, silence fell heavier than before. The story of how it unfolded is what I will tell you now. The morning of my son's wedding began with a thin layer of mist hanging over the villa's garden. Sunlight fought to break through the haze, scattering across the roses I had tended with my own hands for so many years. I woke early, not from excitement but from habit. Years of living alone had taught me to rise before the world stirred. Yet that morning, even the air felt different, weighted with an unease that I couldn't quite shake. I slipped into a simple dress of pale blue and fastened my late husband's wedding band around my neck, where I had kept it since his passing. It was my quiet shield, a reminder that love had once been real, pure, and protective. When I entered the kitchen, I found Helen already there, her figure tall and composed, draped in a silk robe as though the villa belonged to her. She glanced at me, eyes sharp and dismissive, before returning to her coffee. "You should be grateful, Irene," she said, her voice as smooth as marble. "Today your son begins a new chapter. This villa will no longer be so empty." Her words were sweetened with poison. I knew the meaning beneath them. To her, I was an old relic, a wallet in human form, useful only for the property she coveted. I poured myself tea, refusing to rise to her bait. Silence, I had learned, was my greatest defense, but silence also cuts. Victor soon joined her, his presence filling the room with a kind of self-importance that clung to him like his tailored suit. He kissed Helen's cheek and barely nodded at me, as though I were a servant in my own home. "Everything must be perfect today," he said. "Appearances matter. This family must shine." A villa like this makes a statement I knew then, that the villa was not simply a home in their eyes. It was a jewel, a stage, a tool to reinforce their status. To them, I was invisible unless I handed over what they desired. I stirred my tea slowly, watching the steam curl, and wondered how my son had fallen so deep into their world of appearances and ambition. Julia floated into the room shortly after, radiant even in her dressing gown, her hair pinned with delicate pearls. She slipped her arm through her mother's and kissed her father's cheek before giving me a smile too polished to be genuine. "Good morning, Irene," she said sweetly, placing extra emphasis on my name as though it were a formal address, not family. "I hope you're ready. Today will be unforgettable." Her eyes glittered, and though her lips curved upward, there was no warmth. She wanted me to feel small, to sense that I was on the outside of their circle. And I did. The house was soon bustling with activity. Florists moved in and out, setting arrangements in every corner of the hall. Caterers filled the kitchen with the clatter of trays. Musicians rehearsed in the garden. Yet through all the movement, I noticed how often I was overlooked. No one asked for my opinion, though it was still my home. No one acknowledged that every rose in the garden had grown under my care, that the walls held my laughter, my sorrow, my history. To them, the villa had already shifted ownership in spirit, if not in law. I walked through the rooms, touching the frames on the walls, the corners of furniture that had been with me since Thomas's childhood. I remembered his small hands tugging at my skirt, his laughter echoing down the hallways. Now those same hallways carried voices that pushed me further into the shadows. At one point, I overheard Julia whispering to her mother. They were arranging seating, speaking as though the house was already theirs. "After the ceremony," Julia said, her tone low but firm, "we can host every holiday here. It will be perfect. No one in our circle has a villa like this." Helen nodded approvingly. "Yes. Once everything is settled, this will be your crown jewel. A new beginning for both of you." I felt my stomach tighten. Their words left no space for me, not even as a mother, not even as family. In their story, I was already written out. I retreated to the veranda, seeking air, seeking distance. The sky was clearing, the sun stretching stronger now, but inside me a storm grew. I wanted to cry, yet I would not. I had cried enough in the silence of my bedroom, mourning a son I was slowly losing not to death, but to ambition. Out there, beyond the mist, I promised myself that if they wished to see me as invisible, I would learn how to use invisibility to my advantage. Guests began to arrive hours later, dressed in their finery, their laughter carrying across the lawn. Some greeted me with polite smiles, but most rushed to embrace Helen and Victor, praising the splendor of the setting as though they were the hosts. I stood by an ornament in the corner, my presence unnoticed, my contributions unspoken. A few whispered near me, "She must be proud," but their tone was perfunctory, their eyes already drifting toward Julia in her gown. I kept my hands folded in front of me, hiding the tremor that threatened to betray my calm. Pride and humiliation warred within me. This was supposed to be Thomas's day, yet I felt like a trespasser in my own life. As the ceremony hour drew near, Helen approached me again, her voice lowered but cutting. "Remember your place, Irene. This day is not about you. Do not embarrass Thomas. Be gracious. That's all anyone expects of you." I met her gaze, my lips curving into a faint smile. She thought she had won, that I had no voice. But deep inside, I was already preparing for the moment when silence would not be weakness, but strength. The morning carried on with its rehearsed elegance. Musicians tuned their strings, photographers adjusted their lenses, and Julia glided through it all as though she had been born to play this role. I followed quietly, invisible in their eyes, but every word, every glance, every dismissal settled into my memory. By the time the sun climbed high and the mist had long burned away, the villa had transformed into a stage set for a spectacle. To them, I was merely a shadow at the edge of the frame, yet shadows can linger, and sometimes they hold more power than the light. I took one last look at the garden before the ceremony began, breathing in the scent of roses and the memory of the life I had built. Whatever the day would bring, I knew I could not allow myself to be erased. They might see me as invisible, but invisibility has a way of watching, waiting, and choosing its moment. That was the morning of my son's wedding, the morning I realized I no longer belonged in their story. But I also knew the day would not end the way they expected. I used to know my son by the rhythm of his footsteps. As a boy, Thomas ran toward me, quick taps through the hallway, always carrying a question or a joke. The first time his steps slowed and grew careful, I felt the change before I understood it. He came home from college with a new haircut and a fresh poise, the kind that enters a room a second before the person does. Years earlier, on the night of his father's funeral, we stood at the kitchen sink with the water running and the dishes abandoned. Thomas squeezed my hand and said, "I'll protect you, Mom." I kept that promise close, a small warm stone in my pocket, something to hold when the house felt too wide for one set of footsteps. I believed him because he had always been the boy who held doors without being asked. He returned one afternoon in late spring with Julia. The hydrangeas were the color of the sky, and light fell across the foyer like a silk scarf. Julia turned in a slow circle and said, "This place is a dream," and the word place lodged itself between us. I brought out lemon bars because Thomas loved them as a child. He told the story about school trips and sticky napkins. Julia laughed and touched his sleeve. They were beautiful together, and beauty can be blinding when you want so badly to keep believing. The new vocabulary arrived in winter. He asked me to consider downsizing for ease, to travel while you can, to see how the villa might serve a bigger purpose. When I asked whose purpose, he sighed and said I worried too much. He claimed the house felt heavy for one person. I told him a house is heavy only when love has been packed out of it. Calls turned into texts. "Can I call you later? Running into a meeting? Love you." He measured visits in half hours and sat forward on chairs like a man already leaving. I learned to let him go first so I wouldn't have to watch him choose the door. Distance does not always arrive as absence. Sometimes it sits beside you and pretends to be busy. Helen and Victor slipped into our lives with polished smiles and practiced warmth. She brought lilies that smelled like ceremony and complimented my table while suggesting a decorator to modernize the rooms. He admired the woodwork and asked easy questions about insurance, taxes, and casually, market timing. Thomas watched them like a student studying fluent speakers. There were still flashes of the boy I raised. He fixed a leaky faucet and laughed when the spray hit his shirt, and for a heartbeat I saw the child who apologized to the chair after bumping it. On his birthday, I baked cinnamon bread and left it at his apartment with a ribbon and a note. He texted a heart and sent a picture of Julia holding a slice on the blue heirloom plate his father and I bought our first year. The more they visited, the more they looked past me and into the rooms. Julia planned photographs from the staircase, brunches on the terrace, holidays that somehow made me an optional guest. Thomas began saying when he spoke about the house, "We could open the parlor. We could host your friends. They'd love it." I reminded him the deed carried one name. He laughed softly, as though I had told a quaint story from another time. We argued once, softly. He said the villa was impractical, that sentimentality costs more than it pays. I said memory is the mortar that keeps a life from collapsing. He said I deserved rest. I said I would rest when I chose. He held me longer than usual, and still I felt the cold line of distance draw itself between us like chalk. Sometimes we walked the garden and I named the landmarks. This is the oak you climbed until your knees were green. This is the bench where you read your first novel alone. He smiled and said he remembered, but his eyes drifted to the gate and the road beyond it. I understood he was living in a future where the villa was backdrop and I was a shadow outside the frame. A breeze lifted the rose leaves and made a soft applause, as if the garden itself remembered who had tended it through every season. When the engagement was announced, he called sounding breathless and young again. He said they wanted something timeless. He did not ask where it should be, he assumed. I said yes because no felt like locking myself out of whatever part of his life still included me. On the morning of the wedding, I fastened my husband's ring onto the chain at my throat and repeated Thomas's words into the quiet kitchen. "I'll protect you, Mom." I did not say it to remind him. I said it to remind myself that once, love spoke in complete sentences. If that language had changed, then I would learn a new one. The kettle clicked off. A beam of sun slid across the floor. I breathed in and stood taller than my doubts. That day, I would not chase his footsteps down halls that no longer echoed my name. I would set my own rhythm, steady and clear, and walk where I needed to go. It was a week before the wedding when I first heard the truth spoken out loud. The villa was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of silence that hums like a warning. I had gone upstairs to fetch a shawl, but as I passed the guest suite, I caught voices drifting through the slightly ajar door. I paused, holding my breath. It was Julia and her mother. Julia's voice was sweet as honey, but her words stung like thorns. Once the ceremony is done, the villa will be ours. It's the perfect wedding gift. Imagine the photographs on the staircase, the parties on the terrace, the holidays. People will talk about us for years. Helen responded with the sharpness of someone who had already claimed victory. Of course. Irene is old. She has no use for such a property. She'll hand it over because Thomas will insist he is her only son. She won't risk embarrassing him in front of everyone. I gripped the banister, the wood pressing into my palm as their voices seeped into me like poison. My heart pounded, not because I was surprised by their greed, but because they said it so casually, as though my life, my memories, and my dignity were mere trinkets. Julia laughed, a light and tinkling sound, but it carried cruelty. Thomas already agreed. He understands that to build a future with me, we need the villa as our foundation. This place is more than walls. It's the start of everything. With it, we can step into society properly. People will envy us. Helen lowered her tone, though I could still catch every syllable. Victor will be pleased. The villa is not just a house. It's leverage. When your father-in-law hosts his colleagues, this setting will remind them of his influence. And once the deed is secured, Irene won't even have to be mentioned. The words sliced me open. Not even mentioned. They planned to erase me as though I had never existed, as though I were a temporary obstacle standing in the way of their polished lives. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment I considered barging in, confronting them, but I stopped myself. Anger would only feed their narrative. Instead, I withdrew silently, retreating down the hallway until their voices faded behind the closed door. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I remembered painting those walls with my husband, remembered the smell of fresh plaster, remembered our laughter as we argued over curtain colors. The villa was never a crown jewel to be flaunted. It was our sanctuary. Every stone carried the weight of our marriage, our struggles, our joy. And now it was nothing more than a prize for a bride and her mother. The next morning, Victor joined them at breakfast, and I caught another glimpse of the plan. He unfolded a newspaper with deliberate care, as though the world revolved around his timing. "Everything is arranged," he said smoothly. "At the reception, Thomas will make the announcement. The villa as a wedding gift. The guests will applaud. Irene will have no choice but to nod along. Social pressure is the strongest leash." Helen sipped her coffee and smiled with pride. Julia reached for Thomas's hand and squeezed it. My son lowered his gaze, avoiding mine, and I knew then that he was already tangled in their web. I ate in silence, though my chest burned. I wanted to shout that the villa was mine, that no one had the right to decide its fate but me. But silence was safer. Silence let me think. They saw an old woman too meek to resist, and I allowed them that illusion. It gave me time. Later that day, as I walked through the garden, I overheard Julia speaking to one of her bridesmaids. "It's practically ours already," she whispered. "She'll hand it over when the moment comes. And if she doesn't, well, we'll make sure she's shamed into it." Shame. That was their weapon of choice. They wanted to corner me, to force me into surrender by making resistance look like cruelty. I pressed my hand against the trunk of the oak tree Thomas once climbed as a boy, grounding myself in the strength of its roots. They might plan to strip me of dignity, but dignity is not theirs to take. It is mine to guard. That evening, as the household buzzed with preparations, I slipped into my late husband's study. His presence lingered there, in the scent of leather and old books, in the indentation of his chair. I pulled open the drawer and found the letter he had left for me, the one I had read countless times. His handwriting was steady, his words a shield. Guard what we built. Do not let anyone diminish the life we made. I pressed the paper to my heart and felt a spark of resolve. They wanted to stage a spectacle, to turn me into a silent donor of their ambitions. But they did not know what I still carried, what safeguards my husband and I had placed long ago. They did not know that I was not as powerless as they believed. The conspiracy around the villa had been laid bare to me, and though it stung to realize my son was complicit, it also clarified my path. This was no misunderstanding. It was an orchestration, planned down to the applause they expected from the guests. And if they wanted a performance, then I would let them have one. But the ending would not be written by them. I folded the letter carefully, returned it to the drawer, and straightened my back. The villa was more than a house. It was the last piece of my husband's love, the heart of my life, the soil of my memories, and no amount of arrogance or ambition would take it from me without a fight. That night, as the chandeliers were polished and the chairs lined up in the hall, I walked slowly through every room, memorizing each corner. Not because I feared losing it, but because I wanted to remind myself why I must not surrender. They believed I was invisible. They believed I would fold beneath the weight of society's gaze. But I was still Irene, and Irene had endured loss, grief, and loneliness. I could endure this too, and emerge stronger. By the time the wedding day arrived, the villa was no longer mine in the eyes of the crowd. The hall had been transformed into a glittering stage with garlands hanging from the balconies, champagne bubbling in tall glasses, and the air buzzing with chatter. Everywhere I turned, I felt the subtle push of exclusion. It wasn't violent, but it was unmistakable, a steady erosion of belonging that left me standing on the outside of my own life. As the guests arrived, I smiled politely, offering greetings, but the responses I received were thin and perfunctory. They were quick to move past me, their warmth reserved for Helen and Victor, who stood like monarchs at the entrance, compliments showered upon them. The villa is magnificent. This is the perfect place for such a wedding. Not a word was given to me, the woman who had built and nurtured this home for decades. I became a ghost in the corridors I had painted, in the garden I had watered, in the rooms where I had once heard my son's laughter echo. I took a seat at the far end of the hall, hoping to disappear into the music, but the whispers followed me. "She should be proud," one guest said, but his tone carried more pity than respect. Another voice answered, "She should be careful." At her age, what can she do with such a villa anyway? Laughter bubbled around me, low and poisonous. I lowered my eyes to my hands, folding them in my lap to keep them from trembling. At one point, I overheard two cousins of Julia talking in bright, careless tones near the dessert table. "She doesn't even look like the owner," one remarked, glancing in my direction. "It's strange, isn't it? She seems so plain, so ordinary. The villa suits Julia and Thomas much better," I pretended not to hear, but the words burned. My life, my sacrifices, reduced to an afterthought in a place that had once been my refuge. When I tried to join a conversation with some old family friends, the circle closed before me. They shifted their bodies slightly, subtle enough to deny me entry without open cruelty. I stood for a moment holding my glass, feeling the sting of humiliation prickle across my skin. It was as if I had been written out of the story unfolding before my eyes. I walked toward the garden for air, but even there I could not escape the ridicule. A group of younger guests lingered by the fountain, phones in hand, their laughter carrying across the lawn. "Did you see her dress?" one of them giggled. "It looks like she bought it from a thrift shop." Another chimed in, "Well, maybe she's saving the villa for herself. Can you imagine? What does she even need it for? She's alone." Their words were sharp, and though they tried to muffle their laughter, it rang out clearly. I straightened my shoulders and passed them without comment. I had learned long ago that dignity sometimes means silence, that meeting cruelty with words only feeds its fire. But inside, I felt the tightening grip of isolation. Even the memories of love I once carried with Thomas seemed to fade under the weight of mockery and disregard. Back inside, Helen and Victor basked in admiration. Helen wore a gown that shimmered under the chandelier light, her laughter ringing like silver bells. She touched guests lightly on the arm, weaving them into her circle, making them feel chosen. Victor spoke of politics and business with the ease of a man who believed the world bent to his will. People leaned in, eager to listen, eager to be associated with such confidence. And always, when the villa was mentioned, the credit flowed to them, never to me. Julia drifted among the guests like a vision, her gown trailing behind her, her smile carefully measured. When she spoke of the future, she used the word ours again and again. Our villa. Our new beginning. I heard it enough times that I wondered if she truly believed I had already handed over the keys. The guests applauded her words, clinked their glasses, and turned to look at me with expectant eyes. They wanted me to nod, to validate the fantasy they had all accepted as truth, but I did not nod. I sat in my chair, sipping my drink, allowing their gazes to wash over me like waves crashing against stone. My silence unsettled them. A woman across the table whispered, "Why isn't she saying anything? Why doesn't she just agree?" Another muttered, "She's being difficult." At her age, she should know better. The humiliation was sharp, but beneath it something steadier grew. The more they dismissed me, the more I felt the spark of defiance kindle in my chest. As the music swelled and glasses were raised for yet another toast, I caught sight of Thomas across the room. He was laughing with Julia, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist. When our eyes met for a fraction of a second, I thought I saw hesitation, the shadow of the boy he once was. But then Julia leaned in, whispered something in his ear, and the shadow vanished. He turned away, his laughter louder than before, as though to drown out whatever flicker of doubt had crossed his face. I realized then that I was truly alone in that hall, not alone in body, but in spirit. Surrounded by 100 people, I had never felt more invisible. They wanted me small, compliant, erased. And for a moment, the weight of their scorn pressed so heavily that I nearly bent beneath it. But I remembered the letter hidden in the drawer upstairs, my husband's words urging me to guard what we had built. I remembered the feel of his ring against my chest, and I remembered that silence is not surrender. It is patience. It is the gathering of strength before the storm. So I sat through their laughter, through their whispers, through their mocking glances. I let them think I was powerless, that they had succeeded in isolating me. They mistook my quiet for defeat, not realizing that quiet can hold the sharpest edge. When the music faded into a softer melody and the lights dimmed slightly, I rose from my chair and walked toward the back of the hall. My heart was heavy, but my steps were firm. They believed they had cornered me, stripped me of worth. What they could not see was that the isolation they forced upon me would become the very foundation of my resolve. That night, beneath the glittering lights and the rustle of silk gowns, I learned the true depth of their contempt. And I also learned that contempt can be the spark that ignites a fire no one expects. The clinking of glasses signaled another round of toasts, and the hall swelled with anticipation. I sat rigid at my table, my hands folded, tightly, bracing myself without knowing why. Then Thomas stood, his shoulders squared, the microphone in his hand catching the glint of the chandelier. The crowd hushed, 100 eyes rising to meet him, their attention fixed as if he were already a man of great importance. "My friends, my family," he began, his voice booming with a confidence that startled me. "Today marks not just the beginning of my life with Julia, but the beginning of something larger, something enduring. His words floated through the air, sweetly rehearsed, practiced to charm. Guests leaned forward eagerly, smiling, nodding, believing they were about to hear a promise of love. He looked at Julia, then at her parents, and finally, deliberately, at me. As a symbol of this new life, my mother has agreed to gift us her villa. This home, rich with history, will now be the foundation of ours. From this day forward, it will belong to Julia and me. The crowd erupted into applause. Glasses were raised. Some guests even whistled in admiration. "What a gesture!" someone exclaimed. "So generous!" The hall vibrated with approval, the sound pressing in on me until my ears rang. I felt the air leave my lungs in one sharp gasp. My hands gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white. The room blurred for a moment, voices colliding, faces glowing with excitement. But through it all, I saw Thomas's eyes. He didn't look uncertain. He didn't look ashamed. He looked resolute, complicit, as if this had been his plan all along. Julia clasped her hands together and feigned surprise, though her eyes gleamed with triumph. "Oh, Thomas, your mother is too kind," she murmured, her voice carrying just enough for those around her to hear. Tears pooled at the corners of her eyes, shimmering like jewels under the light. She turned toward me, placing her hand delicately over her heart. "Irene, you are the reason we can begin this new chapter. I will honor this villa, as if it were my own family's legacy." The applause grew louder, echoing against the high ceiling. Helen dabbed at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, while Victor lifted his glass as though sealing a pact in front of society. "To Irene," he declared, "to her generosity, her vision, her willingness to ensure her son's success." Another wave of clinking glasses followed. I wanted to speak, but my throat tightened, my words caught between rage and grief. The faces around me glowed with expectation, waiting for my nod, my smile, my surrender. They wanted a performance, and I was meant to play the role of the proud mother giving away her most precious possession. Instead, I stayed seated. My stillness was jarring in that sea of motion. Whispers rose, uncertain at first, then sharper. "Why isn't she standing? Doesn't she agree? Surely she planned this." A ripple of confusion began to spread, but the music swelled again, drowning it out. Thomas stepped down from the dais and approached me, microphone still in hand. He crouched slightly, his face close enough for me to see the sweat at his temples. "Say something, Mother," he urged, his voice low but fierce. "Don't embarrass me now." Everyone is watching embarrass him, as though my silence was the offense, not his betrayal. I searched his face for a glimmer of the boy who once promised to protect me, but all I saw was the hardness of a man, molded by ambition and manipulation. He had chosen his side, and it was not mine. I rose slowly, the chair scraping against the floor. The hall quieted at once, all eyes on me. I could feel the weight of 100 expectations pressing down. Julia's tears glistened. Helen's smile was tight, triumphant. Victor's eyes narrowed, already calculating the effect of my words. And Thomas, my son, stared at me with a silent plea that was not born of love, but of desperation to maintain the spectacle. The microphone hovered near me, Thomas extending it like a weapon disguised as an offering. The crowd leaned in, hungry for my confirmation. I took a breath, steadying myself. My voice was calm, clear, carrying farther than I expected. "This villa," I said, pausing to let the words settle, "is not a stage, not a prize, not a bargaining chip. It is my home, built with my husband, raised with my son, and it does not belong to anyone but me." Gasps scattered through the hall. The applause halted, the clinking glasses froze mid-air. Julia's face crumpled into shock, then into fresh sobs that spilled dramatically down her cheeks. She buried her face in Thomas's chest. "How could she?" she cried. "On our wedding day! To humiliate you like this?" The hall turned restless. Guests murmured, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Helen rose, her voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. "Irene, think carefully. Do you really want to cast shame upon your son in front of everyone who matters? Do you want this to be your legacy? A mother who destroyed her child's happiness?" Victor raised his hand, signaling for calm, but his eyes flashed with fury. "Please, Irene," he said smoothly, though his tone held an edge of threat. "We are all family now. Surely you can see this is the right decision." I stood tall, clutching the chain around my neck where my husband's ring rested. My heart pounded, but my voice did not waver. Family is not built on theft. Family is not built on spectacle. My answer is no. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Julia's sobs and the shuffle of restless feet. Thomas's face hardened, his jaw clenched tight. He lifted the microphone again, his voice trembling with rage. "Then you shame me, Mother. You shame me in front of everyone." I met his gaze, my own eyes steady. "No, Thomas," I said softly, though the words carried to the farthest corner of the hall. "It is you who shame yourself." The hall erupted once more, not in applause but in gasps and murmurs, the crowd splintering into factions of pity, outrage, and fascination. The spectacle they had craved had arrived, but not in the way they expected. And I, standing alone in the middle of it all, felt the sharp edge of isolation give way to something steadier. Resolve. The weight of my words hung in the air long after I had spoken them. The hall, moments earlier alive with laughter and music, now felt like a theater emptied of applause, where every whisper became a blade. I stood in the center, the microphone still trembling in my son's hand, the eyes of 100 guests pressing into me with disbelief and judgment. My refusal had not just startled them, it had shattered the illusion they had all come to celebrate. Julia's sobs filled the silence like a rehearsed melody, her voice quivering with perfect despair. "Thomas," she cried, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. "How could she do this to us? How could she ruin the most important day of our lives?" She buried her face in his chest, and he wrapped his arm around her as though shielding her from me, from the cruelty of a mother unwilling to give away her home. Guests murmured their agreement, sympathy flowing toward the bride as naturally as water rolling downhill. Thomas turned to me, his face flushed with anger. "Do you hear yourself, Mother?" he said, his voice sharp enough to cut the air. "You embarrass me in front of everyone. You humiliate my wife. You humiliate me. After all I've done for you, after everything I've given, this is how you repay me." His eyes burned into mine, demanding surrender, demanding that I bow to the story he had written without me. I felt the burn of shame, not for myself, but for him. I remembered the boy who had once kissed my cheek before school, the boy who had promised to protect me. Now here he was, a man raising his voice against me, wielding public scorn as his weapon. My chest tightened, but my voice remained steady. "No," I said again, the words slicing through the noise, simple and final. Gasps rippled through the room. Some clutched their pearls, others leaned closer to their companions, whispering as though they were spectators at a scandalous play. One woman at the front shook her head, muttering, "She's cruel. A mother should sacrifice." Another answered, "Or perhaps she's selfish." Old women can be that way. Their words reached me, but I let them pass, because the truth of what I carried was heavier and stronger than their gossip. Julia lifted her tear-streaked face, her voice trembling like fragile glass. "I only wanted to be part of this family," she cried. "I only wanted to start our marriage with love. And she rejects me. She rejects us." Her words fell into the crowd like seeds, quickly taking root in fertile soil. Heads nodded, lips pursed, eyes turned against me. Helen rose from her seat, her elegance intact, though her eyes glowed with calculated fury. "Irene," she said, her voice sharp but wrapped in silk, "this is neither the time nor the place to make such a cruel stand. You risk not only your son's happiness but his reputation. Do you wish to see him scorned by society because of your stubbornness?" Her gaze swept across the hall, drawing the audience into her net, making them complicit in the judgment. Victor followed, raising his glass with a thin smile. "To family," he said, his voice steady but cold, "and to unity, which only exists when sacrifices are made." He looked at me as if daring me to contradict him, his eyes promising consequences that extended far beyond this hall. The walls seemed to close in around me. 100 people leaned forward, waiting for me to fold. Thomas's grip on the microphone tightened, his knuckles white. He shoved it toward me, his words hissing. "Say it. Say you'll give us the villa. End this foolishness. Don't make me beg you here." His voice cracked on the last word, but not from sorrow. It cracked from rage. I met his eyes and saw no trace of the boy I had raised, only the man shaped by ambition and guided by the hunger of others. My throat tightened, but I swallowed hard and let my voice rise, calm but unyielding. "I will not give you my home. Not now, not ever. This is not a gift to be demanded. This is not yours to take." The silence that followed was raw, broken only by Julia's wails and the shuffle of feet as guests shifted uncomfortably. Some looked away, unable to watch a mother and son stand as adversaries. Others leaned forward eagerly, savoring the drama. My refusal had become their entertainment, but for me, it was survival. Thomas's face darkened. He turned back to the crowd, his voice shaking with fury. Do you see? Do you see how she treats me? My own mother. She would rather shame me, shame all of us, than show generosity. She has never cared for me the way she pretends. He pointed toward me, his voice rising into a shout. This is the truth of who she is. A murmur of disapproval swept through the hall, directed at me. I could feel the weight of their disdain pressing against my skin, the whispers branding me as cruel, unworthy, selfish. My chest rose and fell, and though my hands trembled, I clasped them tightly in front of me. I would not weep. I would not bend. I looked at my son one last time, letting him see the pain in my eyes, the pain of a mother who had loved, who had sacrificed, who had carried him through every storm. You shame yourself, Thomas, I said softly, but the words carried through the silence. Not me. The hall erupted again, not with music or joy, but with noise, a chaos of voices, of outrage, of disbelief. Julia collapsed into Helen's arms, sobbing theatrically. Victor shook his head with grave disappointment. Guests whispered furiously, their words slicing through the heavy air, and I stood there, alone but unbroken, the sound of my refusal echoing louder than all their voices combined. The hall pulsed with noise after my refusal, a storm of whispers, disapproving glances, and Julia's cries that rose and fell like a practiced performance. Yet in the center of it all, I felt a strange calm. The shame they tried to drape over me slid off like water from stone. My silence, so often mistaken for weakness, became my shield. I knew if I stayed longer, they would claw at me until there was nothing left but their version of the story. So I chose to leave. I set my glass down carefully, the soft click against the table louder to me than all the chatter. Without a word, I turned from the sea of eyes. My heels tapped against the polished floor as I walked toward the exit. The music faltered, conversations dipped, but no one stopped me. Their voices followed like a tide pulling at my back. Accusations, pity, questions. Is she really walking out? She's heartless. Poor Thomas. Every word was a stone, but I carried them with my spine straight. The corridor outside the hall was dimmer, quieter. I could still hear the muffled noise behind me, but each step I took dulled the sound. For the first time that day, I could breathe. I walked past portraits of ancestors who stared down from gilded frames, men and women who had lived through storms of their own. Their painted eyes seemed to follow me, reminding me that survival often wears the face of solitude. I reached the main doors of the villa. The night air swept against my cheeks, cool and steady, and for a moment I closed my eyes, letting it wash away the heaviness of that room. Behind me, my son was still caught in the grip of ambition, his bride still weaving her performance of tears. But I had stepped out of their theater. I pulled my phone from my purse, my fingers steady. The screen lit up, a glow against the darkness. I scrolled to a number saved long ago, one I had never used until this moment. My thumb hovered for only a second before pressing the call. The line rang once. A deep voice answered. I spoke 2 words, no more. Green light. The words tasted both foreign and familiar, like unlocking a door I had kept hidden for years. The voice responded with quiet certainty. Understood. Then the line went dead. I placed the phone back into my purse, my heart beating not with fear but with clarity. My silence inside the hall had been sharp enough to cut, but this silence, the silence of preparation, was sharper still. They believed I walked away defeated. They had no idea that I had just set everything in motion. I lingered for a moment at the edge of the garden, looking out at the roses gleaming pale under the moonlight. This garden had seen my laughter, my tears, my grief. Tonight it saw my resolve. I touched the ring at my neck, my husband's ring, and whispered under my breath, I will not let them destroy what we built. The roses swayed gently in the breeze, as if they were listening, as if they understood. Inside, I knew Julia would be sobbing louder. Helen would be whispering poison into eager ears. Victor would be calculating every possible angle. And Thomas, my son, would be seething, telling himself I had betrayed him, blind to the truth that he was the one who had turned his back first. I could imagine the scene clearly, the chaos I had left behind, but I refused to return to it. My power now was not in words, but in absence. By leaving the stage, I forced them to perform without me, to stumble without the foundation they thought they had secured. As I walked along the path leading away from the villa, the music from the hall grew faint, replaced by the quiet hum of crickets in the grass. The night sky stretched above me, vast and unbothered by human dramas. I breathed it in, each step grounding me more firmly in my choice. They could try to corner me, shame me, erase me, but the moment I had placed that call, the balance shifted. I reached the iron gates and rested my hand on the cool metal. The guard stood nearby, nodding respectfully. He'd seen me walk through storms before. Tonight was no different. "Ma'am," he said softly, and though he offered no questions, I could sense he understood enough. I nodded back and stepped into the night, leaving the noise behind. Silence followed me, not empty, but full, brimming with all the words I had not spoken. It was the silence of choice, of strategy, of a woman who had endured humiliation but refused to be consumed by it. That silence was sharper than any insult hurled inside the hall. It was a blade I carried close to my chest, hidden but ready. I paused once more, turning back to see the glow of the villa's windows, golden against the dark sky. My son and his new family believed they had won, that I had slunk away in disgrace. They could not see that walking away was not surrender, but preparation. They would learn soon enough. I turned back to the road and walked steadily forward, the ring at my neck cool against my skin, the night air steady in my lungs. My silence was not an end. It was the beginning of a reckoning they would never forget. I walked farther down the road until the sounds of the wedding faded behind me, replaced by the steady hum of cicadas in the grass. The night air was cool, and I pulled my shawl tighter around my shoulders. My phone felt heavier in my purse than it should have, as though it carried not just metal and glass, but the weight of every decision I had avoided for too long. I had already spoken the words, but I knew what they meant. Once set in motion, there was no going back. I paused beneath an old oak tree near the edge of the property. Its branches stretched like arms into the sky, familiar and protective. I had stood under this tree with Thomas when he was small, teaching him to whistle, to skip stones, to imagine futures too bright for him to name. Tonight it bore witness again, though this time to a very different lesson. I opened my purse, pulled out my phone, and stared at the screen. My fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the gravity of what I was about to do. The number was already saved, a simple entry under one name, Caldwell. I pressed the call button. He answered on the first ring. His voice was deep, steady, a presence in itself. "Irene," he said, as though he had been waiting. I did not waste time. "Green light," I told him, my voice low but unwavering. The words echoed between us, simple yet final. There was a pause, a silence that carried its own kind of weight. Then his reply came, calm and certain. "Understood. Everything is in place. I'll be there soon." When the line disconnected, I lowered the phone and held it against my chest for a moment. My heart thudded beneath it, not in panic, but in a rhythm that felt almost like triumph. Caldwell was not just a lawyer. He was a man who had once shared dinners at my table, who had seen my son grow, who had witnessed the quiet strength of my late husband. More importantly, he was a man of power in circles that Helen and Victor believed they controlled. They had underestimated me because I had not shown my hand. Tonight, that changed. I leaned against the oak tree, closing my eyes briefly, letting the bark press into my back. Memories flooded in, of my husband reading contracts late into the night, of whispered plans to safeguard our home, of long discussions about how to protect me if one day I stood alone. Caldwell had been part of those conversations. He had been our ally then, and now, years later, he was my shield. I opened my eyes and looked back at the villa, its windows glowing against the dark sky. I could almost hear the chaos inside, Julia's cries growing louder, Helen spinning her narrative like a spider weaving silk, Victor smoothing everything over with practiced words, and Thomas, my son, his pride bleeding into rage as he tried to hold the evening together. They believed my departure was weakness. They thought I had retreated in shame. They had no idea that with one call, I had summoned the man who carried the keys to their undoing. I began walking again, slowly, each step grounding me in the choice I had made. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes, and with every sound I felt lighter, as though I had set down a burden I had carried for too long. My silence inside that hall had unsettled them. My refusal had enraged them. But it was this call, these two words that would change everything. As I walked, I remembered the last conversation I had with Caldwell in his office months ago. He had leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You'll know when it's time," he had said. "It will not be easy, Irene. But when you speak, you must be certain. And when you give me the word, I'll act without hesitation." I had nodded then, unsure of when that moment might come. Tonight, it had. The path curved, leading me past the garden wall where roses climbed and spilled over like cascading fire. I brushed my fingers against the petals, grounding myself in their softness. They had bloomed under my care, as the villa had stood under my guardianship. No matter how loudly others demanded, no matter how theatrically Julia cried, This place was not theirs to claim. It had been secured in ways they could not imagine, and Caldwell held the papers, the signatures, the proof. Soon they would know. The night deepened. A breeze stirred the branches, carrying the faint sound of music from the hall. I pictured the faces inside when Caldwell walked through the doors, his presence commanding silence. He would not need to raise his voice. His authority would speak louder than their arrogance ever could. And Thomas, my son, his jaw would drop when he realized his mother had not come unprepared, that she had allies stronger than his in-laws, that the villa he thought was within his grasp was beyond his reach. I stopped at the edge of the driveway, the gravel giving way to smooth pavement. For a moment, I looked down at my hands, the same hands that had cooked for Thomas, stitched his torn shirts, guided him through school, held him through heartbreaks. These hands had given so much. Tonight they had given nothing away, and for the first time in a long while I felt their strength. I slid the phone back into my purse, adjusted my shawl, and turned once more toward the glow of the villa. Soon I would walk back inside, not alone, but with Caldwell at my side. I could already imagine the silence that would follow his entrance, the way conversations would die mid-sentence, the way faces would pale. My call had set it in motion. The words still lingered on my lips, soft but firm. Green light. I lifted my chin, steadied my breath, and took the first step back toward the hall. When I stepped back toward the hall, the sound of voices reached me before I saw the faces. It was no longer the cheerful chatter of a wedding. It was sharper, fractured, restless. I lingered just outside the doorway, hidden in the shadow of the corridor, and listened to the storm inside. Julia stood at the center of it, her gown gleaming under the chandeliers, her face streaked with tears. She clutched her bouquet as though it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. Her sobs were loud enough to echo against the walls, each one drawing fresh sympathy from the crowd. "I never wanted any of this," she cried. "I just wanted love. I just wanted family." But how can a marriage begin when his own mother humiliates us like this? Her words spilled like poisoned honey, pulling hearts to her side, painting me as the villain before I even returned. Helen stood close behind her daughter, calm but purposeful, her voice low yet cutting through the room like a blade. "Do not judge Julia too harshly," she said to the guests. "She is young, innocent, and undeserving of such cruelty." This was supposed to be her happiest day, but instead she is shamed in front of you all. What kind of mother chooses pride over her son's future? The words found their mark. The guests shifted in their seats, whispering in clusters. Some nodded, some frowned, some looked toward Thomas, who stood stiff and pale beside his bride. He kept his hand on her shoulder, squeezing it as though rehearsed, but his jaw was set, his expression stormy. He was torn between anger and the faint shadow of doubt, though the anger always won. Victor, ever the politician, rose from his seat with a carefully measured smile. He raised his hands for silence, his presence commanding the room with ease. "Please, friends, let us not forget why we are here. Tonight is about love, about unity. Yes, there has been misunderstanding, but family always finds a way. Irene is a complicated woman, perhaps overwhelmed, perhaps unwell. We must forgive her." His words were not generous, they were strategic, shaping the story so that my defiance became weakness, an ailment to be pitied. Laughter bubbled from one corner, a group of younger guests with their phones raised, recording the drama as though it were a spectacle staged for their amusement. One boy held his phone high, broadcasting the scene live to the world beyond those walls. "This is insane," I heard him mutter, his voice carrying. "A wedding turned into a soap opera. Look at the mother walking out. It's going viral already." The glow of screens multiplied as others joined in, capturing every tear, every whisper, every accusation. What began as a family conflict was becoming something much larger, a scandal slipping beyond our control. From where I stood in the shadows, I watched the faces. Some guests whispered that I was selfish, that I had ruined my son's future. Others leaned close to each other, voices low but audible. Perhaps she is right. That villa is hers. Why should she give it away like a party favor? The room was no longer united in judgment. Lines were forming, unseen but unmistakable, dividing those who believed the story Julia and her parents spun, and those who began to question it. Thomas finally stepped forward, his voice breaking through the din. "Enough," he said, though the room did not quiet as much as he hoped. He gripped the microphone again, his knuckles white, his expression strained. "This is still my wedding. This is still our day. My mother may have chosen to humiliate us, but I will not let her ruin everything." His words trembled with fury, but also with fear. The fear of losing control in front of the very people he wanted to impress. Julia clung to his arm, weeping harder, her cries theatrical. "Please, Thomas, don't let her destroy us. Don't let her take away our beginning." Her voice cracked in perfect rhythm with the murmurs of sympathy that spread across the hall. Helen wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders, glaring toward the door where she must have sensed I lingered, her eyes glittering with disdain. The noise swelled again, a storm of voices, of opinions, of judgment. The music had stopped. The dance floor remained empty, the air thick with something heavier than celebration. Even the waiters carrying trays hesitated, unsure if they should serve champagne to a room so poisoned with tension. I stood very still, letting it all unfold without my presence. They thought I had abandoned the hall, but in truth, I watched them expose themselves. Julia's sobs were too practiced, Helen's speeches too polished, Victor's calm too rehearsed. The performance was unraveling, and the crowd could see the seams. The young guests' live stream only magnified it, capturing every insincere glance, every forced tear, every calculating smile. As I watched, I realized something important. I did not need to speak again. They were undoing themselves without my help. Their hunger for the villa, their eagerness to frame me as cruel, their thirst for applause. It was all spilling out, and the more they reached, the more they revealed their greed. I touched the ring at my neck, feeling the cool metal steady me. My husband had once told me that truth does not always need to shout. Sometimes it waits in silence until the noise collapses under its own weight. Tonight, his words felt alive in my chest, so I remained in the shadows, calm and quiet, while inside the hall, chaos reigned, and soon, very soon, the door would open, and another presence would enter to silence them all. The storm inside the hall had reached its peak when the doors opened. At first, no one noticed. The guests were too busy murmuring. Julia was still clinging to Thomas with sobs that echoed like broken music, and Helen's sharp voice was slicing through the crowd, trying to hold her control over the room. But the sound of steady footsteps on the polished floor carried farther than all of it. One by one, heads turned. The conversation stilled, the whispers died, and an uneasy silence spread like ripples in water. I stood at the edge, near the shadows of the doorway, when I saw him. Mr. Caldwell entered with the weight of someone who did not need introduction. He wore a dark suit that caught the light with every step, his posture straight, his eyes focused. There was nothing hurried or uncertain about him. He carried himself with quiet authority, and in that moment he seemed larger than the hall itself. The musicians lowered their instruments. The waiters froze mid-step. Even the young man with his phone held in the air lowered it slightly, sensing that something irreversible was happening. Caldwell did not glance left or right as he walked. He moved down the center aisle and people instinctively shifted aside, as though making room for him was the only natural response. His presence carried its own gravity, pulling the attention of every soul in the room. Victor rose to his feet, his practiced smile faltering. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice too sharp to hide the tremor. "Beneath, this is a private family event." Caldwell stopped only a few feet from the center of the hall. He looked directly at Victor, then at Helen, and finally at Thomas and Julia. His silence alone was enough to still the air. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but resonant, carrying to every corner of the hall. "I am here by invitation," he said, "and I have business that cannot wait." A murmur ran through the guests. Some leaned forward, whispering, "Who is he?" Others exchanged glances, sensing that the evening had turned into something far greater than a wedding drama. Helen tightened her grip on Julia's arm. "This is inappropriate," she hissed. "Who dares interrupt a sacred ceremony?" Caldwell's eyes flicked to her, cool and unflinching. "I dare, because truth does not wait for convenient timing, and tonight, truth must be spoken." Thomas stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You have no place here," he spat. "This is my wedding, and I will not let some stranger walk in and—" But Caldwell raised a hand and Thomas stopped. It wasn't magic. It was authority, the kind that comes from a life spent commanding rooms and silencing lesser voices. The crowd was watching too closely for Thomas to risk further humiliation. "I am not a stranger," Caldwell said evenly. "I am a shareholder of Victor's company. A man who has invested time, resources, and trust. And more importantly, I am here on behalf of Irene, the rightful owner of this villa, whose dignity has been trampled under your performance tonight." Gasps spread through the hall. All eyes swung toward me, still standing in the shadows by the door. Julia's sobs faltered, her mouth parting in shock. Helen's face drained of color. Victor's composure cracked, his jaw tightening as though he had been struck. Caldwell continued, his voice steady. "You thought this villa was yours to demand, yours to flaunt as a prize. But it was never yours, and it will never be yours. The legal documents are clear. The ownership is indisputable. Irene is not simply the widow of this house. She is its foundation, its co-architect, its protector, and I hold the papers that prove it." The silence that followed was absolute. Every guest leaned forward, hungry for more, caught between disbelief and fascination. The young man with the phone raised it again, live streaming every word. The audience beyond the walls would hear it too, carried into countless homes before the night was through. Victor tried to recover, straightening his shoulders. "This is a stunt," he said, his voice louder than necessary. "You think you can walk in here and shame us with theatrics? The law does not bend to spectacle." Caldwell's gaze did not waver. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a folder, and held it up for all to see. "This is no spectacle. These are legal filings, signed and sealed, detailing the structure under which this villa was secured. Irene and her late husband ensured its protection long ago. It cannot be gifted without her will. It cannot be taken without her consent. And no announcement, no performance, no manipulation will ever change that." Whispers swelled like a rising tide. Guests exchanged looks, their faces shifting from judgment to awe. Some stared at me with new eyes, no longer pitying or condemning, but curious, even respectful. Others looked at Victor and Helen with suspicion, their admiration souring into doubt. Julia's tears stopped altogether. She looked at Thomas, her face pale, her lips trembling not with grief but with fear. Her hands clutched his arm, but his eyes were fixed on Caldwell, wide and shaken. I stepped forward then, leaving the shadows. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor, the sound cutting through the murmurs. As I reached Caldwell's side, he inclined his head slightly to me, a silent acknowledgement that this was my moment. I felt the weight of every gaze, but I no longer shrank beneath it. Thomas's voice finally broke the silence. "Mother, Why? His words cracked, heavy with disbelief. Why would you do this to me? I looked at him, my chest aching with both sorrow and resolve. I did nothing to you, Thomas. I did what I promised your father I would do. I protected our home. Gasps rippled again, softer this time, laced with the sting of realization. The hall that had moments before been filled with mockery now stood in reverent quiet, waiting for what would come next. Caldwell closed the folder, tucking it back into his briefcase with deliberate calm. "The matter is settled," he said, his voice final. "This villa is Irene's. Any attempt to challenge that will not only fail but expose those who try." The chandeliers glittered above us, their light falling like judgment. No one clapped this time. No one dared. The power in the room had shifted, and everyone could feel it. I stood taller than I had all evening, the ring at my neck cool against my skin, my silence now a mantle of strength. For the first time that night, I no longer felt alone. The silence that followed Caldwell's words was heavy, almost unbearable. I felt the weight of every eye in that hall pressing against me, not with pity as before, but with something sharper, more curious, even unsettled. The applause they had once prepared for Thomas's announcement had died on their lips. Instead, the air buzzed with the tension of revelation. Caldwell placed the folder on the table near the center of the room, and its presence was louder than any speech. I stepped forward, my fingers brushing the cool edge of the folder. I lifted it gently, opening it with deliberate calm. My husband's name was there, in careful ink, alongside my own. Decades earlier, when we built our life together, he had insisted that we protect what we created. He had been a man who thought beyond the present, who looked at me and saw not just a wife, but a partner. His foresight had carried us through the years, and tonight it carried me through the storm. I looked at Thomas, whose face was pale, his lips parted, as though he were struggling to find words. "You once promised to protect me," I said softly, but my voice carried to every corner of the hall. "You stood beside me when your father was lowered into the ground, and you swore that no matter what, you would never let me stand alone. Yet tonight, you tried to take from me the one place that still carries his breath, his laughter, his memory. You tried to strip away the last piece of him that remains with me." Julia shifted uneasily beside him, her tears suddenly drying, her hand tightening on his arm. Helen's jaw tightened, though she forced her face into a mask of composure. Victor looked down, his hands clenched on the back of his chair. They all knew the truth could not be argued away. Caldwell's voice rang out again, calm and steady. "What none of you realized is that this villa was never vulnerable to schemes or declarations. Irene is not just the widow of the man who built it. She was the co-founder of the trust that secures it. Legally, she has always been more than its occupant. She is its guardian." He paused, letting the words sink in. Even Thomas himself once signed documents affirming this arrangement, though at the time he did not understand the weight of what he was signing. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Heads turned toward my son, whose face reddened with humiliation. His eyes darted back and forth, searching for escape, but there was none. He remembered, as I did, the afternoon years ago when he had scribbled his name on a paper his father had given him, thinking it was a simple acknowledgement of adulthood. He had been proud then, eager to step into responsibility, not realizing he had signed the very protection that now stood against him. I laid the folder down again, pressing my hand lightly against its cover. "This was never about money," I said. "This was never about power. This was about memory, about the life your father and I built, and I will not see it handed over like a prize at a banquet. I am not ashamed to stand alone if it means keeping the promise I made to him." The room had shifted. The judgment that once rained down on me now splintered. Some guests nodded, whispering, "She's right." Others looked away from Helen and Victor, their admiration curdling into suspicion. Even the young man live streaming seemed captivated, his camera steady, his voice caught with awe as he whispered to whoever watched beyond the walls, "The mother's not weak. She's stronger than all of them." Thomas finally spoke, his voice breaking. "You deceived me," he said, anger and shame tangled in his throat. "You let me believe the villa was mine to claim, and all this time you had already locked it away." I looked at him with sorrow that cut deeper than anger. "No, Thomas, I never deceived you. I protected you, just as I protected myself. You were too young to see it then, but I hoped one day you would understand that not everything can be given, and not everything should be taken. Love cannot be built on theft. Family cannot be forged through force." Julia's face hardened, her tears gone as quickly as they had come. She pulled slightly away from Thomas, her mask slipping under the weight of exposure. Helen placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, but even she could not disguise the panic in her eyes. Victor remained still, his expression unreadable, but his silence spoke louder than his usual eloquence. I stood taller, my voice steady, my hands no longer trembling. I may be a widow, but I am not defenseless. I may be older, but I am not irrelevant. And tonight, in front of all of you, I will remind my son and his new family of one truth. What is mine is not theirs to demand. My home, my dignity, my life. They belong to me, and I will decide what to give and what to keep. The chandeliers above glimmered, casting light across faces now stripped of certainty. The villa itself seemed to breathe with me, its walls no longer a backdrop for their ambition, but a fortress of my resolve. For years they had mistaken my silence for surrender, my patience for weakness. Tonight they saw the truth. Caldwell closed the folder with finality, his hand firm on its cover. "The matter is clear," he said. "The law stands with Irene. And any further attempt to challenge her will be met not with negotiation, but with consequences." The silence that followed was not the silence of scorn, but of reckoning. And in that silence I felt my husband's presence, steady and proud. The silence after Caldwell's declaration did not last long. It broke apart like glass under pressure, scattering into frantic murmurs and sharp whispers. Guests who had once clapped for Thomas now avoided his eyes. Faces that had glowed with sympathy for Julia shifted with doubt. A tide was turning, and I could feel it in the air, as certain as the swell of a storm rolling in from the sea. One businessman I recognized, a longtime associate of Victor's, rose from his seat with a stiff expression. He pulled out his phone, scrolling quickly, his brow furrowed. Then, with a shake of his head, he left the hall without a word. Another followed, then another. The exit doors opened and closed with soft thuds, each one like a nail hammered into Victor's carefully crafted reputation. The power he wore like a second skin was slipping away with every retreating back. Helen noticed it too. She leaned toward Victor, her whisper sharp and urgent, but he did not answer. His jaw was clenched tight, his eyes locked on Caldwell. The man who once commanded rooms with his charm now sat cornered, stripped of his authority by the simple weight of truth. His empire was built on perception, and perception was collapsing right in front of him. Julia's mask began to crack. The tears she had so carefully displayed dried on her cheeks, leaving streaks of makeup that no longer looked delicate, but desperate. She clutched Thomas's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "Do something," she hissed, her voice carrying enough for those nearby to hear. "Don't just stand there. Fix this." But Thomas stood frozen, pale, and shaken. His bravado from earlier had vanished, replaced by a boyish panic he could not disguise. The guests noticed. One whispered, "He didn't even know his mother still owned everything." Another answered, "Imagine marrying into this mess." Laughter, quiet but unmistakable, rippled through the room. Julia's cheeks flushed with humiliation, her eyes darting wildly around the hall as though searching for an escape. The live stream only fed the fire. The young man with the phone grinned as comments flooded his screen. "It's everywhere now," he whispered to his friends. "People are eating this up. The mighty family undone by their own greed." His voice wasn't cruel, just fascinated, like a spectator at a play he hadn't expected to be so riveting. Yet I knew the damage was real. What happened inside that hall was no longer confined to those walls. By morning, it would be headlines, shared videos, whispered rumors in boardrooms and clubs where Victor once held sway. One of Victor's business partners finally stood. "I can't be tied to this," he muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. "I won't risk contracts with someone whose family can't even manage their own wedding without scandal." His words landed heavily, each syllable dragging Victor deeper into ruin. The man walked out, his departure followed by more guests, each exit a visible fracture in the facade. Helen tried once more to rally the room. She lifted her chin, her voice sharp and commanding. "Do not be deceived," she said. "This is an ambush, nothing more. Irene has staged this to shame us. But family, true family, cannot be broken by paperwork." Her attempt at control faltered as the audience shifted uncomfortably. Some shook their heads, others whispered with skepticism. Her power had always been rooted in perception, in convincing others of her superiority. Tonight, that foundation crumbled. Julia's own parents began to falter. Her father avoided eye contact with anyone, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie. Her mother's defiance looked more brittle with every passing second. Julia herself, once the radiant bride, now looked like a cornered animal. She pulled away from Thomas suddenly, her eyes wild. "I can't do this," she cried, her voice shrill. "I won't be made a fool." She tore the veil from her head, the delicate lace ripping as it caught on her earrings, and hurled it to the floor. Gasps rose around her. Some guests stood, unsure whether to intervene, while others leaned closer, hungry for more. Thomas tried to reach for her hand, but she slapped it away. "You promised me," she screamed. "You told me this villa would be ours, that your mother was nothing but a formality. And now look at us, mocked, disgraced, ruined before we've even begun." Her words echoed off the high ceilings, carrying every ounce of betrayal she now felt. Betrayal not from me, but from the man she had married. The hall erupted into chaos. Guests argued openly, some defending me, others condemning them, many just feeding off the drama like moths to flame. The young man's live stream captured every moment, and I could see him grinning at the flood of reactions scrolling across his screen. What was once a carefully staged celebration had become a public unraveling, a domino line collapsing faster than anyone could stop. I remained still, watching, letting their downfall unfold without interference. For years I had been told silence was weakness, that quiet meant invisibility. But tonight, my silence was power. Every word they spoke, every frantic move they made, only revealed more of their greed, more of their arrogance, more of their lies. Caldwell stood beside me, calm and steady, his presence anchoring the storm. He leaned slightly toward me, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "You don't need to say another word," he said. "They're doing the work for you." And he was right. Victor's reputation cracked with every departing partner. Julia's marriage fractured before it had even begun. Helen's authority collapsed under the weight of her own arrogance. One by one, their carefully arranged dominoes toppled, each fall louder than the last, until the once grand hall was nothing but chaos. I touched the ring at my neck, feeling its weight against my skin. My husband's foresight, Caldwell's loyalty, my own silence. They had brought me to this moment. And as I watched the family who had tried to erase me unravel under the eyes of society, I knew the villa was not just protected. I was. The chaos of the hall still echoed faintly in my ears when I slipped away, leaving Caldwell to manage the storm of questions. I walked through the villa's familiar corridors, the air heavy with memories. My steps carried me to the study, the room that had always belonged more to my husband than to me, though I had kept it untouched after his passing. Tonight, I needed its stillness. Tonight, I needed to face my son without an audience. Thomas found me there not long after. His footsteps were unsteady, and when he pushed the door open, his face was pale, his eyes wild with shame and anger. The proud groom of hours ago was gone. What stood before me was a man stripped of illusions, his voice rough when he spoke. "Why would you do this to me?" "To us?" I sat behind the desk, my hands folded over the worn leather surface. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I opened the drawer and pulled out a faded envelope, its paper yellowed by years. My husband's, handwriting stretched across it steady and familiar. I slid it across the desk toward Thomas. "Because of this," I said. He hesitated before taking it. His hands trembled as he unfolded the paper. His father's words filled the air again, the same words that had steadied me countless times. "Guard what we built. Protect it for yourself and for our son, even if he forgets its value. Remind him that home is not a prize but a legacy." Thomas's eyes flicked over the page and his lips parted, though no sound came out. His shoulders slumped, and for a moment I thought I saw the boy he had once been, standing in this very room, asking his father questions about the world. But the moment passed, and his anger returned. He crumpled the letter in his fist. "He's not here anymore," he spat. "You are. And you chose to humiliate me." I rose slowly, my hand steady as I reached for the small velvet box I had placed on the shelf. Inside was the wedding band my husband had worn until the day he died. Its gold had dulled over time, but its weight was unchanged. I held it in my palm, letting it catch the light. "This," I said softly, "was the circle that held us together. Your father and I built this villa with it as our bond. When you tried to take the house, you weren't just taking bricks and wood. You were tearing at the very bond that created you." His eyes flickered to the ring, and I saw the conflict in his expression. Pride fought with shame, greed with memory. I stepped closer, placing the box on the desk with finality. "I am putting it away," I told him. "I will keep it in the safe, along with the letter. They are reminders of what mattered, and tonight I see clearly that you no longer carry that memory." Thomas's jaw tightened. He pressed his hands against the desk, leaning toward me. "You're choosing a house over me," he said bitterly. The words pierced me, but I stood firm. "No, I am choosing the promise your father and I made to each other. I am choosing the life we built, the dignity we preserved, the truth we left behind. You asked me to hand it away as though it were nothing, and when I said no, you turned me into an enemy. That is not what a son does. That is not what love does for a moment." Silence stretched between us. His breathing was ragged, mine steady. Then his eyes dropped, and he whispered, "I didn't know what I signed." I nodded, my chest aching. "You signed because you trusted your father. You signed because once you believed in us. Tonight you betrayed that belief, but the paper still stands. And so do I." I crossed the room to the safe hidden behind the bookshelf. My fingers moved over the dial with the ease of memory, and the heavy door clicked open. Inside were a few mementos, the letter I had read so many times, and now the small velvet box. I placed the ring carefully inside and closed the door. The sound of the lock sliding shut echoed through the room, final and unyielding. Thomas watched, his face unreadable. His fists opened and closed at his sides, his body taut with emotions he could not contain. At last he shook his head. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice low. I met his eyes, my own steady, "No, Thomas." The only regret I carry tonight is that I raised a son who let others tell him that greed was greater than love. His mouth opened as though to answer, but no words came. He turned sharply and left the room, the door slamming behind him. I stood in the quiet that followed, my chest heavy but resolute. The letter and the ring were locked away, safe in the darkness of the safe, but their meaning lived in me. They were not reminders of what I had lost. They were reminders of what I must protect, no matter the cost. For a long moment, I stayed in the study, breathing slowly, letting the silence settle over me. The chaos of the wedding, the humiliation, the confrontation, all of it had led to this. My bond to the past was no longer fragile. It was sealed, unbroken, untouchable. When I finally stepped away from the desk, I knew one thing with certainty. The chapter with Thomas was closing, and another was beginning. By the time I left the study, the wedding was no longer a celebration, but the smoldering remains of one. The hall that had once been filled with laughter and music now felt hollow, drained of its splendor. Tables sat half-abandoned, glasses toppled, flowers wilting under the weight of neglect. Guests had fled in clusters, whispers trailing behind them like smoke. What remained was the aftermath, ugly, undeniable, and unshakable. I stepped carefully across the marble floor, my heels clicking softly in the silence. Julia stood near the edge of the dance floor, her gown torn where she had ripped away her veil. Her face was pale, streaked with makeup, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. She no longer looked like the glowing bride who had floated into the hall hours before. She looked broken, desperate, and angry. When her gaze met mine, she flinched and turned away, muttering something bitter under her breath as she gathered her skirt and stormed past the remaining guests. The doors banged shut behind her, the sound final and cruel. Helen followed quickly, her hand clutching Victor's arm as though she feared he might collapse. The elegance she had carried so easily earlier in the day was gone, replaced by a brittle edge. Her words came sharp and fast, laced with venom, but they were meant only for him. I could not hear them clearly, but I knew their weight. They were words of blame, words of desperation, words that cracked through the polished exterior of their marriage. Victor, once unflappable, walked stiffly beside her, his head bowed, his face gray with defeat. I heard later that within days contracts evaporated. Associates withdrew their trust, business partners distanced themselves, investors pulled away. The empire Victor had built so carefully over decades collapsed like sand under waves. And Helen, who had once carried herself like a queen, found the invitations to her glittering social circles drying up, the admiration turning to avoidance, the whispers behind her back cutting deeper than any knife. Thomas lingered in the hall longer than anyone. He stood alone by the remnants of the cake, staring at it as though the tears of sugar and cream might somehow hold answers he could not find elsewhere. His tuxedo was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, his eyes vacant. He looked like a man who had not just lost a wife but a future, a son who had gambled everything on the approval of others and walked away with nothing. I watched him quietly, unseen from the corner of the room. He rubbed his hands together, restless, his lips moving as though speaking to someone who wasn't there. I wondered if he was arguing with me in his mind, or perhaps with himself. Julia had abandoned him, her vows discarded as easily as her veil. His in-laws had fled, their promises of power turning to ash. And what remained was only the truth, that he had stood against his own mother, and in doing so, lost more than he ever imagined. One of the younger cousins approached me timidly, her voice soft. "Aunt Irene," she said, "I'm sorry for how they treated you." Her eyes were wide, filled with shame, not her own, but borrowed from watching the cruelty of others. I placed a hand gently on her shoulder and nodded. "Remember this," I told her. kindness is never weakness, and dignity is never for sale. She nodded solemnly, and I hoped the words would stay with her long after this night. As the last guests trickled out, the hall grew still. The musicians had packed away their instruments, the waiters cleared the abandoned plates, and the chandeliers cast light over a room that no longer felt grand, but exposed. The celebration was over, not because of me, but because truth had finally stepped into the light, and it left no room for pretense. Julia's hasty departure soon became a story of its own. I heard whispers spreading like fire, that the bride had abandoned the groom before the night was over, that she had been seen in tears, accusing him of deceit, that she would never forgive the humiliation. Within days, it was confirmed. The marriage dissolved before it even began. The papers filed quietly, but not quietly enough to stop the gossip. She had left him with nothing but the echo of her demands and the wreckage of promises they had both built on lies. Victor's fall was swifter than I expected. His reputation, once untouchable, became the target of ridicule. News outlets picked up the viral video dissecting every moment, every accusation, every tear. Business partners abandoned him one by one. His name, once spoken with respect, now carried the weight of scandal. Helen faded beside him, her influence gone, her friends abandoning her with the same haste they had once embraced her. And Thomas, my son, wandered through the aftermath like a ghost. He called me once in the following days, his voice hollow, but I did not answer. I let the phone ring until it stopped. I could not be the one to soothe him. He had chosen his path, and now he had to walk it. That night, as I locked the villa's doors, I felt the silence settle around me, not as a burden, but as a balm. The house was mine still, its walls strong, its garden alive. The echoes of humiliation had been replaced by the knowledge that justice, quiet and steady, had prevailed. The people who tried to strip me of my dignity had lost their own. I stood by the window, watching the moonlight spill across the garden, and let out a breath I had held for too many years. The cost had been high, but the outcome was clear. They had underestimated me, and now they had paid the price. The morning after the wedding, the villa felt different. The sun rose quietly over the garden, casting long golden beams across the roses, still damp with dew. The chaos of the night before had left its shadows, but here, in the stillness of my own home, I felt a clarity I had not known for years. The villa had survived storms greater than this one, and so had I. I walked down the long corridor toward the front entrance, my hand brushing the polished wood of the walls as I passed. Each touch reminded me of what this house represented. Not just bricks, not just wealth, but the years of effort, love, and memory that had built it. My husband's laughter had once echoed in these halls. Thomas's footsteps as a child had raced through them, and now my own strength was woven into every corner. It was not simply a house. It was my life's work, my sanctuary, my proof that silence could hold power. The guard stood waiting near the iron gates. He straightened as soon as he saw me, his cap tucked under his arm, his posture respectful. In his hand, he held a clipboard with a fresh sheet of paper. I had asked him the night before to prepare it. Now it was ready. A list of names, carefully written, deliberate, and final. At the top was Thomas. Below it, Julia, then Helen, Victor, and a few others who had proven themselves willing to strip me of everything for their gain. He handed me the clipboard without a word. I scanned the page, my eyes calm, my decision steady. I took the pen he offered and signed my name at the bottom. The ink flowed smoothly, black and unwavering. The moment the pen left the paper, I felt something close inside me, like a door being locked after too many years of standing open. "Keep this list by the gate," I told him quietly. "No exceptions. These names are not to set foot here again." "Yes, ma'am," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of loyalty. I stepped forward to the gate, my hand resting on the cool iron bars. The lock hung heavy in my palm, its key already waiting. I turned it slowly, hearing the satisfying click as the mechanism slid into place. Then I pulled the gate closed, the metal, groaning softly, and set the bolt across. The sound echoed through the morning air, final and strong. For a moment I stood there, my hand still on the iron, my eyes closed. That gate had always been open to Thomas, to anyone he loved, to the family I had once hoped to embrace. Closing it now was not easy. It was the hardest act I had ever carried out as a mother. But it was necessary. Without boundaries, there could be no peace. Without limits, there could be no dignity. When I opened my eyes again, the garden stretched before me in quiet beauty. The roses swayed in the breeze, their petals catching the light like tiny flames. Beyond them, the villa stood tall and proud, no longer threatened by whispers or schemes. I felt taller too, as though the act of locking that gate had straightened my spine and steadied my breath. The guard returned the clipboard to his station, and I walked back up the stone path toward the front steps. Each step was lighter than the last. I carried no bitterness, only resolution. The past had been painful, but it no longer chained me. The villa was safe, my dignity intact, and my heart clearer than ever before. As I reached the steps, I paused and looked back once more at the locked gate. On the other side lay betrayal, greed, and manipulation. On this side lay peace, memory, and healing. The line was clear now, and I knew I would never allow it to blur again. I turned the key in my hand one final time before slipping it into my pocket. The small weight pressed against the fabric, a reminder of the decision I had made. It was not just a key, it was a promise. To myself, to my late husband, to the life I still intended to live. A promise that what was mine would remain mine, and that I would never again allow anyone to diminish my worth. The villa's doors opened as I approached, sunlight spilling into the foyer. I stepped inside, breathing in the familiar scent of wood and flowers, and felt at home in a way I had not in years. The house welcomed me back, no longer under siege, but standing as it was always meant to. Whole, strong, and silent. I smiled to myself, the kind of smile that carried no triumph, only peace. Closing the gate had not been the end of something. It had been the beginning. The days after the wedding carried a strange quiet, the kind that follows a storm. The villa no longer echoed with the sting of betrayal, but with something softer, steadier. For the first time in years, I woke without dread pressing on my chest. The house felt lighter, as though it, too, had been waiting for me to close the gates and claim my peace. One afternoon, Caldwell visited. He arrived without fanfare, carrying not a briefcase this time, but a basket of fruit from his orchard. His presence, usually so commanding, softened in my home. We sat in the garden among the roses, sipping tea while the breeze stirred the petals around us. He spoke little of the wedding, as though both of us knew its ugliness did not deserve more words. Instead, we spoke of the future, of how healing sometimes comes not from clinging to blood ties, but from building new ones with those who choose to stand beside you. His daughter joined us later, her eyes bright and curious. She was young, not much older than Thomas had been when he first learned to drive. She looked at me with a kind of reverence that startled me. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever seen," she said shyly, as if confessing a secret. "My father told me everything. You didn't shout, you didn't fight like they did, but you still won. I want to be like that someday." Her words touched me more deeply than she could have known. I had spent years believing that my silence was invisible, that no one noticed the strength it took to endure with dignity. Yet here was a girl, full of promise, looking at me not as someone broken, but as someone whole. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently. "Strength isn't always loud," I told her. Sometimes it's in knowing when not to bend, even if it means standing alone. As the days passed, others came too. Neighbors, colleagues of my late husband, even acquaintances who had once kept their distance. They brought meals, flowers, or simply themselves, sitting with me in the garden, filling the villa with warmth it had not known in years. Slowly I realized that family is not always bound by blood. Family is built by choice, by respect, by shared truths. And yet, Thomas appeared one evening at the gate. I watched from the balcony as he stood outside, shoulders slumped, his tuxedo gone, but his shame still heavy on him. He did not try to push past the guard. Instead, he simply looked up at the house, his eyes searching for me. The guard approached with the clipboard in hand, reminding him that his name was on the list. Thomas nodded, the fight gone from him. He looked small, like the boy I once cradled, not the man who had stood against me. I descended halfway to the garden path, but stopped where the light from the villa ended. He lifted his gaze to me, and for a moment, we simply stared. "I'm sorry," he said at last, his voice hoarse. I didn't know how much I was losing until it was gone. The words pierced me, but I stayed rooted. My silence stretched between us, not harsh, but unyielding. I thought of the letter, the ring, the safe behind the bookshelf. I thought of the humiliation he had dealt me, of Julia's crocodile tears, of Helen's sharp tongue, of the villa nearly stolen in the name of his ambition. And I knew forgiveness could not come tonight. Some wounds needed more than apologies. Some bonds could not be forced back together. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said softly, and then I turned back toward the villa. The guard closed the gate behind me, the click of the lock echoing across the quiet evening. My heart ached, but it no longer bled. The distance was painful, but it was necessary. Later, Caldwell's daughter stopped me in the garden, her expression troubled. "It must hurt, turning him away," she said gently. "It does," I admitted, "but sometimes love means saying no. Sometimes it means protecting yourself so that one day he might learn the lesson he refused to see before." She nodded, her young eyes wiser than her years. "Then you're teaching more than just him. You're teaching all of us." Her words stayed with me. In her admiration, I saw something I hadn't expected, a continuation, a legacy not built on inheritance but on example. My story was no longer only mine. It had become something others could carry, something that could inspire those still learning to draw their own boundaries. That night, as I walked the halls of the villa, I realized I was no longer alone. The family I had lost in Thomas was real, but the family I was finding in others was just as real. Caldwell, his daughter, the neighbors who came with casseroles, the young cousin who whispered her apology. They were threads weaving into something strong and new. I stopped at the window, looking out at the locked gate. Beyond it lay regret, betrayal, and broken promises. Within it lay choice, respect, and healing. And for the first time in a long while, I felt not just like a survivor, but like a woman reborn. The villa was quiet when the final guests and visitors stopped coming, when even the curious had grown tired of whispering about the scandal that had unfolded within its walls. What remained was silence, but not the heavy silence of humiliation I had once feared. This silence was chosen, peaceful, and steady. It was the kind of quiet that allowed me to hear my own breath, to feel the beat of my own heart, and to remember who I had always been beneath the weight of betrayal. I spent more time in the garden, tending to the roses my husband had once planted. Their roots had dug deep over the years, just as mine had. I trimmed their stems, watered their soil, and watched as new buds bloomed even after the storm had passed. They reminded me that life does not end because of broken trust or shattered dreams. It begins again, often in the most unexpected ways. Some evenings, I walked through the halls of the villa with only the glow of the lamps to light my path. Each room carried a memory: the study where my husband drafted the contracts that protected us, the staircase where Thomas once slid down the railing as a boy, the kitchen where I baked bread during winters when laughter was still abundant. These memories no longer haunted me. They grounded me, reminding me that the past, however painful, could coexist with the present without consuming it. I thought often of Thomas. His face, the night he stood at the gate, was etched into my mind, his apology clumsy but real. I did not hate him. I could never hate the child I had carried and raised, but I knew that love does not mean surrender. Love means setting boundaries, even when it hurts. Perhaps one day he would learn the difference between inheritance and legacy, between ownership and respect. Until then, my heart had to remain guarded. Caldwell visited often, always with the quiet steadiness of someone who understood. We spoke of practical matters, repairs to the villa, legal filings, community projects, but sometimes, when the evening light stretched long and golden, we spoke of deeper things, of loss, of resilience, of the ways people underestimate the quiet ones, only to discover that quiet is not the absence of strength, but its truest form. His daughter continued to visit too, her admiration for me both humbling and healing. In her, I saw not just the future, but proof that my story had meaning beyond my own walls. It was she who asked me one afternoon, "Do you ever regret it, walking away from the hall that night instead of fighting them there?" I smiled, brushing dirt from my hands as I tended the roses. "No," I told her, because walking away was not retreat. It was the beginning of everything that followed. Sometimes dignity is not in the words we shout, but in the silence we keep until the right moment comes. The scandal faded with time, replaced by other news, other dramas. But the lesson lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Neighbors who once overlooked me now greeted me with respect. Strangers who had watched the live stream sent letters, some sharing their own stories of betrayal, some simply thanking me for showing that quiet strength could stand against arrogance. I often sat at my husband's desk in the evenings, running my fingers over the grain of the wood, and thought about the journey that had brought me here. There had been humiliation, yes, but there had also been resilience. There had been betrayal, but there had also been loyalty. And most of all, there had been silence. My silence, which had carried me farther than any scream ever could. What I learned is this: blood alone does not make family. Respect does. Trust does. Choice does. My son had forgotten that, and perhaps one day he will remember. But I had remembered it in time. And because of that, I still had my home, my dignity, and my peace. As the sun set one evening, casting the villa in soft gold, I walked to the iron gate and touched the lock once more. It was firm, unyielding, exactly as I needed it to be. Beyond it stretched the world, unpredictable and often cruel. Within it lay my sanctuary, my chosen family, and my new beginning. I did not feel trapped behind the gate. I felt free. I breathed in the scent of roses carried on the breeze and whispered to myself, "Strength is not in holding on to those who betray you. Strength is in letting go and still choosing to live." And with that, I turned back toward the house, the place that would forever hold my story. My silence had not been defeat. It had been my weapon, my shield, and finally, my rebirth.